Today's webinar is titled, Who'd Have Thunk It? Inventing and Naming Your Brainchild. Our presenters today are Jon L. Roberts, Ph.D., and Jessie N. Roberts, Esquire. Jon Roberts earned his bachelor's in imaging science at RIT during the big move from downtown Rochester to the Henrietta campus. He worked for the CIA while completing his Ph.D. from Syracuse University, and then took night classes to earn his law degree from George Washington University National Law Center. Today, as a senior partner in the Marbury Law Group, Jon Roberts practices security clearance law, patent, copyright, and trademarks. He holds more than 50 U.S. and foreign patents, and he counsels U.S. and foreign clients on development and protection of intellectual property. Jessie Roberts earned her BA and MFA from Brandeis University. Her law degree is from Vermont Law School. Before starting her own firm, Delos LLC, Jessie was the Trademark Administrator for Identification, Classification, and Practice at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO. During that time, she was a senior negotiator for the USPTO to the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, for meetings of the Nice Agreement Union. She is the author of the book, International Trademark Classification, A Guide to the Nice Agreement. Jessie is also the chair of the Trademark Relations with the USPTO Committee for the American Intellectual Property Lawyers Association. Throughout their careers, Jon and Jessie have maintained a steadfast passion for the arts and music. Jon has sung with the National Symphony Orchestra, and they have appeared together in several theater productions, at times even playing the roles of a married couple. Today, Jon and Jessie are going to discuss the process of coming up with a product name and how Jon and others come up with successful inventions. They will also discuss really bad names and equally really bad inventions. They will focus not on how to file applications, but rather on the qualitative aspects of naming things for trademark purposes, as well as identifying a problem and going about solving it for patent purposes. They may even sing. Take it away.
Thank you. The subtitle is actually a little bit of a misnomer because, in fact, we're going to talk about naming first and inventions later. So I will start off with trademarks and some branding issues that you may run into. This is what you need to know before you commit to a trademark, and it's sort of like a marriage. You can even get divorced. First, I'll start out with explaining what a trademark is, and this language is taken directly from the Trademark Act. A trademark includes any word, name, symbol, device, or any combination used or intended to be used to identify and distinguish the goods or services of one seller or provider from those of others, and to indicate the source of the goods or services. I will be using some of these terms throughout the presentation, so I felt it was best to give you the definition as it's presented in the Trademark Act. A trademark is an adjective and should always be followed by a noun. For example, Kleenex, brand, facial tissue. This is sort of the gold standard of how to present your trademark. The trademark, the word brand, and then the goods or services on which it's used. Very often brand will be left out, but as I said, this is the gold standard, and the most important factor is that the trademark is used as an adjective and not the noun of the goods or services themselves. And in order to register the trademark at the USPTO, it must be used on particular goods or services. A trademark is not a noun used as a noun. It's not a word that clearly describes the goods or services on which it's used, and I will get into this a little bit more later in the presentation. It's not a word or design that is in use by another entity on goods or services that are similar to your own. And there are other types of words that may or may not be used as trademarks. The specifics are presented in the Trademark Act. I'll get into some of them in the presentation, but for the real specifics about what you can and cannot register through the USPTO, it's really best to go to the Trademark Act itself and the rules of practice, both of which are available through various government websites and also through the website of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. There is a hierarchy to choosing a successful trademark. The first, and again, here's a gold standard, is a coined term. That's a term that's invented for trademark purposes. An example is Kodak, which is used for photographic supplies and now for many other technological goods and even services. But this is a word that simply didn't exist before the company came up with it to identify their goods and services. The next in the hierarchy is an arbitrary term. That's a known word, but it has no significance in connection with the goods or services on which it's used. And a good example of this is Apple for use on computers. Apple is certainly a known word in the English language, but it has no connection with computers and was really a brilliant term to use to identify something as disparate from the term itself as computers. The next is a suggestive term that gives consumers an idea of the characteristic of the goods or services on which it's used. Getting further down on the spectrum is a descriptive term, which is a word that describes an ingredient, quality, characteristic, function, feature, purpose, or use of the good. It can be registered under special circumstances, but these circumstances may be difficult to show. And again, the specifics are in the Trademark Act and probably go into a little more detail in the trademark rules and regulations. Finally, a term that cannot be registered through the USPTO or through any other organization is a common commercial name for the goods or services, or what's considered a generic term. You cannot register chocolate cake to identify your chocolate cake product. There are some extremely successful trademarks that are good to look at to give you an idea of some that you think would have no connotation with the goods that they're used on, but in fact have become almost synonymous with the goods themselves, so long as they're used as an adjective and the goods themselves follow as the noun. The first example I give is Kleenex, which is the trademark for facial tissue as well as some other paper products. The term simply has no meaning in the English language. It's a suggestion of cleanliness because the word clean in a bastardized spelling is used in the mark, but in itself, it's not a word that has any meaning in the English language. The next, again, I'll go to Kodak, brand used on film and cameras and other photographic and technological goods. Again, the term has no meaning. It was coined, and it really has no suggestive connotation either. So this is a very high in the hierarchy because it doesn't suggest anything. It's a coined word used to be the trademark for this company's goods and services. Xerox brand copy machines. The term is derived from xerography, which was the original copying technique used by the machine. Who knows what technology is used today, but that's where Xerox comes from. And the term itself, again, has no meaning, although it is suggestive of the technology used in the original copying machine. These are trademarks that almost got away, and here comes Xerox again, Xerox brand copy machines. It was becoming a generic reference to copying machines. People said they were going to Xerox something, which is death to a trademark. And the company itself mounted a public relations campaign, and the line that they used was even Xerox can't Xerox. And in fact, you may have noticed recently that Band-Aid brand adhesive strips or Band-Aid brand bandages are also doing that, because Band-Aid has become or is on its way to possibly becoming a generic term for an adhesive bandage, and Band-Aid is not allowing that to happen. It is a trademark, it's a valid trademark, and they want to keep it that way. Another example is Monopoly brand real estate game. It was becoming a generic reference to a board game. It was used by many others to identify a Monopoly-type board game, and the company actually had to go into litigation to maintain its trademark significance of the term. And now, if you notice, wherever you see Monopoly, you'll see it also is always followed by real estate game or Monopoly brand real estate game. These are some trademarks that did get away. Linoleum. It was a trademark for the flooring made by the original company, but they never registered it. And eventually other people started using linoleum to identify their flooring products. So this first user of it challenged the use by a later user, and the court said that even if it had been registered, it was now so widely used that it had become generic and could not function as a single source indicator. That kind of leaves open the question as to whether, if they had registered it to begin with, would they have been able to defend and protect their trademark so that other people couldn't use it and it would not become generic. But at this time, at the time that this challenge was brought by this first user, it was not registered and had been so widely used and not policed by the original user that the court found that it was generic and was the common commercial name for this type of flooring. Another very interesting one is the word aspirin. It lost its trademark status in the US, France, and the UK as part of World War I reparations. So in the US and in France and the UK, you will see aspirin as the generic name for a pain-relieving compound. However, it is still considered a proprietary term for Bayer AG, which is the original developer of aspirin, in over 80 countries, such as Canada, Mexico, Germany, and Switzerland, who were not part of this World War I reparations agreement. That's a very interesting one. But in the U.S., and this comes as a surprise to people very often, aspirin is a generic term, but in other countries it's registered as a trademark for pain-relieving compound. This slide is captioned "A trademark is a trademark is a trademark." These are some terms, and there are many, many more that I simply, I could have had 5 more slides just on this topic. These are terms that are registered in the USPTO. They're valid, existing, maintained registrations, and should never, never be used as generic nouns, although they often are. Rollerblade is one. Rollerblade brand inline skates. You can't, when you see signs that say rollerblading prohibited, they are in fact infringing on the trademark of the rollerblade company, the company that makes rollerblades. Another one is crockpot. Crockpot brand electric cooking appliance. Very often in recipes, you'll see this would be great made in a crockpot without any reference to it being the proprietary term of a specific company. Windbreaker, used all the time as a generic term. It is not. It is a registered mark, and it's for jackets as well as many other pieces of apparel, but specifically when it is misused, it's most often misused as a noun for a light external jacket. Jet ski, registered mark for recreational watercraft. This too used all over as a generic term and should not be. And finally, realtor. Realtor brand real estate brokerage service. There was actually some litigation on this, and the courts came down finding that realtor was a valid trademark. It had been misused by many, but it was in fact a real estate brokerage service, and that this mark identified it coming from a particular organization. There are many, many more that I can't get into, but it's very interesting to see which ones are in danger of becoming generic terms. And many of these owners are very good about policing their marks and trying to get people to stop the infringement, because if it's shown that they don't do anything, eventually a case could be brought in court and the court could find, well, you didn't do anything, so you couldn't have cared, so why should we worry about protecting your trademark when you didn't do it? So these companies do try, but sometimes it's a little overwhelming. The misuse is overwhelming. Another thing to consider when you're contemplating naming your goods or services is to steer clear of marks that are similar to those of others. There is case law that says it's up to the second comer, it's up to the second users to find something that's not similar to something that's already been registered or used by others. Some factors to consider, and this too comes from case law, so this is something that the courts will consider when they look at a case between two entities who are using similar marks. First, they'll look at the similarity or dissimilarity of the marks in their entirety as to appearance, sound, connotation, and commercial impression. What this means is if you add an S to someone's registered mark, you're probably not going to get away with it being adequately dissimilar to let you register your mark or let you use it. The second is the relatedness of the goods or services in the application or the registration at the USPTO. And this is sort of a balancing act. The more similar the marks, if the marks are very similar, and the goods are dissimilar, even then you probably won't be able to get it registered. But if the marks are somewhat dissimilar and the goods are somewhat dissimilar, then you could get them registered. An example of this is Domino. Domino is a registered mark for sugar. It's also a registered mark for pizza restaurants and pizza delivery services. Yes, it's the same mark, but the goods and services are so dissimilar that even this similar mark can exist in the marketplace and people won't be confused as to the source of those goods or services. The next is the similarity or dissimilarity of established, likely to continue channels of trade. If a mark is used to identify something that's pretty exclusively in the medical field, and someone else, again, uses a similar, maybe not identical, but a similar mark for a children's toy product, chances are courts and the USPTO would find that these could coexist in the marketplace. The conditions under which and the buyers to whom sales are made, the two polarizations are the impulse buyer, you see it on the magazine shelf or the candy shelf when you're checking out at the supermarket, or careful, sophisticated purchasers. And certainly the marks can approach some similarity if their buyers are very dissimilar, the impulse buyer as opposed to the careful, sophisticated purchaser. And then another thing to consider is the number and nature of similar marks used on similar goods or services. For example, you'll find in the USPTO there are hundreds of marks that use the word easy in it. Because there are so many that use the word easy, any dissimilarity in the goods or services will allow another easy mark to coexist with the ones that exist. So that's something to consider also, is how many are out there, and in your own interest, you want something that's going to distinguish your goods from others. In a way, trademarks is a shorthand advertising tool. When you see a trademark and you connect that with a certain level of quality, the next time you see that trademark, you're going to expect that level of quality. Now, of course, it would be nice to use a similar mark for something that has a very high level of quality, but what if it doesn't? What if the mark you choose is similar to a mark that doesn't have a high expectation of quality in the consumer's mind? That you want to avoid at all costs. And now a couple of real-life stories. One is the Firewall story and how these marks were selected. Firewall is a mark for keyboard sanitizing products and also other sanitizing products. It was sought to suggest and not describe the function of the goods, but it is suggestive and very interestingly suggestive. Vire suggests virus and other baddies that might be found on a keyboard. Wall suggests the ability of the product to prevent transference of the virus or other baddies to the user. And the combination of these terms resulted in a suggestive yet non-descriptive and memorable trademark for the goods. That's the process that you need to go through when considering a suggestive kind of mark like this. The next one is the Delos story, which is how I chose the mark for my law firm. It is a service mark to identify a law firm. It's not linked to any specific partner names in order to avoid needing to change it when the partners change, which is something to consider if you have a mark that's being used on a service where the component members of that service may change. And it has no significance in the relevant field, which is the practice of law. Now, the selection was based on a misconception. I'm really interested in Greek mythology, and I thought that Delos was the island that Apollo was born on, and I think Apollo is really cool. Turns out it was actually Delphi, but that's okay, because it resulted in a name that's interesting and memorable when the backstory is told, and I'm asked it very often, why did you name your firm Delos? And then I launch off on this nice long story, and people will actually remember the name because of it, because it's kind of funny. It's based on a misconception. Now, Apollo is, in fact, buried on Delos, if you believe that gods ever existed and could be buried anywhere. So there is a connection, but it certainly has nothing to do with the practice of law. And I think that pretty much wraps it up for me on trademarks. Yes, now we go on to strategic patenting.
Great. Now, I'll talk about the patent stuff, but let me just sort of mention one quick thing. Being married to a trademark attorney is an adventure in itself, because if I were injured and bleeding profusely and asked for a Band-Aid, I would never receive one. But if I asked for, honey, please bring me a Band-Aid brand adhesive bandage, I would get what I asked for. So trademarks are important in a variety of situations. Now, we're going to talk about strategic patenting under my section. And this is not about the patent application process. It's about actually how you go about inventing something. Now, this really breaks down into several different areas, and in particular, I'm going to focus on three areas. The first of those is basically the inventing based upon technology by itself or the market itself. When I say this really has not necessarily any specific relationship to your company, but rather what markets are out there. And anybody, for example, when I first started getting into some of the inventions that I didn't have a company at all. I just knew some technology and saw some holes in the technology and went ahead inventing into that. So you can invent based upon the technology itself without any specific market in mind, or you can have a particular market that you're looking at and say, well, here's a hole in the marketplace, maybe I should invent something, or I have an idea for something in that marketplace. The second area is protecting your own market, and by your own market, I'm referring to if you have a particular company or are working for a company, what are the things that you can do to go ahead and invent in an area that protects your company for the future? It's a focus on your company's activities, what your company is up to, and where you think your company is going. The third area is inventing with respect to your competitor's future. And a lot of people are starting to pay more attention to this, which is looking at potential improvements to your competitor's products. And we'll discuss why we do that, but the basic reason is if you have the improvement of your competitor's product patented, your competitor is not going to be able to do that. So it may give you a particular better position in the marketplace. And all of this I refer to as offensive patenting, meaning use the patent system to capture the future. Because you did something maybe in the past, you can't get coverage for that, but you need to look forward to the future in a variety of areas in order to have a successful inventing program and intellectual property portfolio. Now, in terms of the market-driven inventing, the focus there is on what are the market-enabling technologies. And here, what we're talking about is not necessarily what your company is doing, but really looking at what's in the market, what's the future. Many of you have grown up in technologies, you've come to RIT, you've learned lots of different things, and now you're out in the marketplace. And you certainly have the ideas of your own company in mind, but there may be some future market needs that may have absolutely nothing to do with what you're doing now. And for example, one of the things that I was never involved in at all was in the area of preventing the spread of diseases. And yet I did a whole series of inventions in that because I saw a need for that and went ahead and did that sort of thing. And you can do that as well. So by focusing on what future markets might be, whether or not you have a particular direct interest in that, you can find a potential for filing patent applications and securing your market space. And for there, some of the things I would suggest that you look at are certainly what are new markets, but what are key technologies that drive specific markets. For example, if a particular product is very expensive, but it's a really neat product, well, what kind of invention might exist that could control the costs of producing that particular product? The second is area of production or use of future market needs. There can be many inventions or many products that are out there that you can combine into something that will come up with a whole new product, a whole new market based upon the particular need that you see. So, as an example, if you were to combine electronics with plastics, with, wood, and these are all clearly existing objects, but if you take them and combine them into something new that's never been used before, that's never been seen before, you can even come up with your own market for something, and as a consequence, wind up with very good protection. Now, I'm being very general here because this is the notion of saying, well, I understand the technology, so why don't I invent something? It's not particularly driven by your specific activity with your company or something you may be involved in on your own. It's just a knowledge of technology and markets and identifying missing areas. Now, in order to achieve the best protection when you do this or indeed any other invention, you need to focus on areas of how your particular technology, when you apply for your patents that is, you need to focus on how your patents will be litigated. In other words, you can almost obtain a patent on almost anything, but the question is when you go to litigate the patent, which is really how you prove the value of the patent, that's when that value comes up, and that's where you get the right to enforce your patent against others. So what I'm suggesting when you talk to your patent attorney, and which is why I'm not aiming this at here's what a patent application is, you want to make sure that you focus on the potential litigation associated with your patent. And by that I mean, if you come up with a particular invention, you want to explore all the different aspects of the invention that you can think of. What are the materials that it's made of? What are the uses for this? What are some of the uses that may not be the prime use that you've thought of? And so if you have a breadth of claims, that will wind up with a product and an intellectual property that will have a great deal of value, and it'll also ease the litigation associated with it, and perhaps you can capture more revenue, and there's nothing wrong with being rich. The next area is the management driven, and this is a little bit more specific to what your company is doing. Now, what we talked about just before was more general in nature. You know technology, there's markets, you may or may not be involved. Here, you're looking at very specific company-driven types of inventions. And here, many engineers may think that their managers really are sort of useless because they're the ones who are doing all the inventing. But let me disabuse you of that, because most managers are managers of a company because they have a pretty good idea on how to run a company, what the future markets are going to be, and what are the aspects associated with your company that make it a valuable competitor in the marketplace. So very often, you see the second major bullet, facilitation is a key. Very often what you would see major companies do is get together with a facilitator who will actually run a meeting, and you'll have a bunch of people in a room, because it's really absolutely true that two heads are better than one. And if you wind up with a lot of people together in a room and you want to focus on things like, what's the future of our company? What's the future products of our company? You'll wind up with lots and lots of different ideas, not only for major products, but for offshoots of the products you already have. In other words, how to make them better, how to produce them in a more effective fashion. And by having this kind of, I refer to it as a management-driven inventing, where the managers of the company get together and say, well, you know, where are we going with this? What's the future? What do our customers want? And for a situation like this, once again, many people will downplay the marketing department, but the marketing department is a very key player in this sort of inventing, because those are the guys who are out in the field, seeing what the competitors have, seeing what the public in your particular market area wants to see. So they've got a very good insight into what the future market might be for your product, or the future market generally might be for your company. And this kind of discussion that you would have here, where a CEO or the marketing department says, here's where we should be going, here's what the customers want, and getting together with the top technical talent in your company will start to identify, if not necessarily the specific solutions, the directions that solutions can take. And that becomes very important in defining what the future of your company is and will be. So once you get into that, the technical part of your company will then say, okay, now I understand what it is that we want to do and the direction we want to go. Now the technical part will say, here's how we would go about doing that. And that how part can take place in a variety of different fashions. It can be everything from, I need to fix these little parts of the process because that's a problem. I need to come up with a whole new product because that's what we need to do to stay current in the marketplace. But then once you accomplish all of that in this management-driven model, then you can go ahead and start to actually invent in the areas that are important to your company. So you focus the team energies on the inventing in the future and less on fixing the present. So if you, for example, if you have a process that just takes too long and your answer is, well, I'm just going to combine these two groups together to make a single assembly process, that's interesting and that fixes your present process, but doesn't necessarily help you into the future. The focus on all of this is look into the future. Now, what you do with all of these things is, here's a way to go about it. First of all, you consider what you've done in the relatively recent past. And when I say recent past, the United States is now a first-to-file country. So you have to be very careful that you haven't sold something. Up until about a year ago, you had a grace period after you sold something to file a patent, and that is not the case any longer. So be very, very careful. But do consider things that you've done and have been doing in the last year that haven't necessarily been announced, you haven't really thought about necessarily protecting, but that protection is still available to you provided that you haven't sold anything or derived any money from that particular thing that you might consider filing a patent on. And then the things you want to do are consider the services that have the highest values. You might have something that's I've seen this time and time again where an inventor will come to me and say, well, this wasn't a big deal. Well, it may not have been a big deal to you as to that person as the inventor, but it has extremely high value in the marketplace because nobody else solved this particular problem. Another thing to look at is what are the problems that kept you up at night and took you a long time to solve? Because it's pretty close that if you had that problem, those in your industry probably have had that problem as well. And if you were the first to solve this very difficult problem, that may be something that you want to go ahead and file a patent application on. And interestingly, whether or not that's a key area of your company, is you still may want to file a patent application on that because it may solve someone else's problem. So what was the solution to that problem? You can then brainstorm that with your company's visionaries to see if that's a future product or process or service that you might want to offer for the company. But even if it isn't, you still may want to protect that. Now the next thing is defining your future. Is that where is your company going to be in 5 to 10 years? That's a very important thing for you to consider because you could be working very intensely on something right now, but in fact you want to look ahead 5 to 10 years to say, where's this technology going? For example, faxes are great, but faxes are disappearing. And to this day, somebody can come up with an improvement to a fax machine, but is that really going to be something that's valuable for your company? So you want to look ahead 5 to 10 years and see where you're going to be. Who's going to be your competition? What is that competition doing? You can derive an awful lot of information from simply looking at what your competitors are up to. To go to the point that Jessie raised with Apple. Well, Apple pretty much created this market for this iPad, and now all of a sudden, after the iPad came up, you're seeing tablets of every size, shape, and form coming up. Well, that's because people looked at their competition, they were kind of caught short, and now they're trying to play catch up. So you want to look at your competition, what are they up to? You want to look at your markets. You may be in 5 or 6 or 10 markets, and GE did this when I was with them. They said, we want to look at all the markets we're in, and if we are not number 1 or number 2 in those markets, we're out of those markets. And they made a very conscious decision to say, what are our highest value markets, and we're not going to play in the ones, even though they may be profitable, we're not going to play in those markets where we're not as profitable because it's taking away valuable resources. And once you identify those technological markets that are your highest value ones, then you could say what technologies drive those markets, what should we be looking at? And you can then have people assigned to do research, what's the technology that's coming down, how might it be useful, and proceed with defining your future market from that standpoint and protecting things through invention. Now, in terms of strategic inventions, what products, we talked about that, but what does your company need to be competitive? Now, you can identify lots and lots of different products for the future, but what is it that your company needs to be competitive? If your company focuses on, for example, the production of, I'm making this up, production of glass, and we find that glass products are being used more and more for lots of different things, well, you may not invent for the specific products that are being done, but you may invent for the technology that gives rise to those products. What new technologies of glass production do you want to do, given that you see glass types of products being more increasingly put out into the marketplace? Now, a question to ask yourself is, why don't you have that particular technology right now that you need? If you define that technology and you go, well, we don't have anybody who knows anything about that, well, maybe you should get somebody. And part of that analysis is, what is your HR situation? Who are the engineers that are in your company? What gaps are there in your engineering expertise? And you go out and hire the people that you need. So when you do this investigation into the 5 or 10 years in the future, not only do you look at what products should be out there, but what is your position to get to those kinds of products? And that could be equipment, it could be facilities, it could be technology, and you go out and you get that technology. And the last bullet is, what is the core, or what we refer to as a pivot problem, that stands between you and that future capability? Is it because you only have 10,000 square feet of space and you need 100,000? Well, that's not necessarily inventing, but you need that space in order to do the inventing so you can hire the people, so that you can look at that pivot technology that will help you. And once you identify all of that, then you can start saying, okay, I need to invent in these particular areas. Now we're talking about the competitors. Just as you want to look at where you're going to be, where are your competitors going to be? Another example, which is not necessarily in inventing, is the Divergent Organization. They have airlines, and they used to be big into records. Well, they've gotten rid of their CDs. The Virgin stores are gone. And why did they do that? Because the head of it, whatever his name is, decided, hey, the technology, everything online is more and more broadband. This whole CD thing, it's going out. And so even though he was very profitable, he got rid of that because he looked at where the competition was going. And the competition was going to downloading and licensing and things of that nature. Now, when you look at your competitors, you say, okay, I'm looking at a specific competitor. They have different products, a little bit different than we do, but what technology do they need? And if I'm looking at their technology, you ask the question, why don't I have that? And if you're jealous, if you will, of the market that one of your competitors has, and you want to get into that, the question you need to ask yourself is, why aren't you into that now? And if the answer is, well, it's a great market, I want to be into it, but again, I don't have the resources, I don't have the right people, I don't have whatever, the facilities, I need to make sure that I get that in order to be able to have intellectual property that I own and in things that I invent in order to be competitive in this marketplace. So whereas before we said the management was saying, here's where I want my company to be, but a very key intelligence source for you all is, where are your competitors and where are they going? You can do a lot of research to find that out, and you may find that you have technology now that your competitors might need, or you may find that that's a market that you want to be in, you just haven't considered it, but it fits very nicely into your overall portfolio of products and services. Brainstorm those solutions to the competitor's problems, what the competitor is up to, and you can very easily come up with your own technological solutions that are worthy of your own patenting. Okay, now once you come up with all of these things, you basically, what are the other ideas, and you basically add them to the list. So at the end of all of this, where you're doing management-driven, what's your company doing, what are your competitors doing, you wind up with this huge list of things that you could be doing. All right, so what do you do with them? Well, you get together in a room with, once again, with all your management people, your engineers, and so on, and you say, well, what's the market or business or competitor leverage potential? Where will this get us? You wind up with 50 ideas, but you're not going to pursue 50 ideas because frequently you won't have the budget to do it. So one of the questions you need to ask is this particular technology or market likely to endure? If you are producing light sources for fax machines, you can come up with a better light source. But will that likely endure as a market for you? And the answer is probably not, so maybe that gets checked off the list as something not to do. Then you need to look at two other things which do affect patentability. One is what you're talking about, and I'm doing it in a different order. Is it technically feasible for you to do what you want? Just because I think it'd be a great idea to be able to teleport to California doesn't mean that it's technically feasible to do that. So what's involved in that? If it's technically feasible, then all of those inventions that you're talking about that are on your list are something that you may want to consider. But you also have to consider whether or not it's called non-obviousness, which is a patent term, but it's basically is the notion that if a blue ink pen never existed, only black ink pens existed, and I say, wouldn't it be great to have a blue ink pen? Well, that's going to be deemed to be obvious because everybody knows inks come in different colors. You can have blues and reds, and so you really need to look at whether or not your invention is something that is really kind of not a really easy thing for somebody else to do. But be cautious, for those of you in management, your engineers will constantly underestimate whether or not what they've done is novel or unobvious. Engineers in general, and I mean this affectionately, will always downgrade what they've done because they think if I've done it, everybody else can do it. That is not the case. And then you draw a line. What can you afford to do? If you can't afford to go after 50 really good ideas, you got to pick the top 10 and go after those, because there is a reality to inventing. Okay, so now with all those considerations, now you've heard about the any trademarks or anything of that nature. Those fit into, in general, a lot of times trademarks will come after patents, which is not to say that patents are more important, but marketing people will very frequently come up with the actual names for all of these products and inventions that you've come up with based upon what we've just talked about. And what I would suggest to you as whoever the inventors are, I would suggest to you that, yeah, you can go ahead and name your product, but at the end of the day, it'll be the marketing people who control that situation. So don't get hung up on the name. But the marketing people need to pay attention to what the name actually is. And that's where your management or your other folks will come in. But don't get too worried about that. Those of you who are in the inventing mode, pay attention to those characteristics that we talked about. And you could wind up with a very extensive patent portfolio, even with patents that have nothing to do with your specific line of business, but with patents that have something to do with either your competitors' lines of business or with the suppliers who supply to you. So don't be shy at all about filing patents on things that contribute to your particular corporate health as well.
If I could, were you finished? If I could jump in with just 2 points, one about trademarks, one in general. And this is not to denigrate patents, but a patent is finite. A patent has a lifespan, and that span is now 20
years. That says 20 years from the date of the earliest application.
Date of earliest application. A trademark has no time limit. So long as the USPTO exists, so long as you exist and you file the correct maintenance documents, your patent will exist forever. Someone once asked Coca-Cola, which would they rather lose, all of their physical assets or their trademark? And they said, we'd rather lose the physical assets. Trademarks are incredibly valuable. The general point is there's an office at the USPTO. It's the Office of Independent Inventors Programs. And in fact, they're having a 2-day seminar at the end of this week in Washington. And it's an excellent, excellent resource for small inventors, independent inventors, small businesses to get really excellent help and information about how to navigate your way through both the patent and trademark process. They have regional meetings, and this one they do in Washington is the big one for the year. But if you get to the USPTO website, look up the Office of Independent Inventors, and you'll find some excellent, excellent information there. That's it.
Well, thank you, Jon and Jessie, for sharing your expertise on product development and patents and trademarks. I think that all of our participants will agree that your insights are both enlightening and entertaining. We do have some time for questions. We haven't had many come in, but if you had any come to mind, feel free to submit them through the chat on the side of the screen, and Jon and Jessie will address your questions live right now. I can start with a comment that we had from Mike, and he was saying that it is very expensive and confusing to obtain a patent. So do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, my comment is that's a fair statement, and it's getting more so. The patent office has raised their fees. It takes the examining corps, how should we say this, sometimes makes mistakes. So I really don't have a good solution for that. The best thing that you can do is when you're putting your claims together, and this is why. Don't let your patent attorney operate in a vacuum, which many people do. They turn it over to the patent attorney, and the patent attorney runs off with it. What you want to do is focus on claims that are key to your invention, and any patent attorney can put 100 claims in an application, and that's extremely expensive. What you really want to do is focus on the key claims that make your invention different from somebody else's. And if you can focus on those in your claims, that will drive your costs down, because there will be not so many, hopefully, not so many what are referred to as office actions, which is the patent office rejecting your claims. And one other thing I would say is that don't be frightened by the fact that in your first office action, the patent office will reject all of your claims. I literally have over 50 patents, and there has not been a single one of them where the patent office did not reject all of my claims on the first office action. That's because they simply don't have the time to really dive into it. I don't care if they say they do, they really don't understand the application fully. And you have to then go in your response and straighten them out as to why you're different from whatever whatever the reasons were that they rejected your particular patent application in the first place. So don't be frightened about that.
Okay, so we had another question from Todd, and Todd says, my company places a claim on all inventions of employees. However, I've had inventions and ideas outside of our domain. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that really is based upon your employment agreement. And one of the things you need to be cautious about, and I'm not giving your company or you any ideas, here's the reality of the situation, is that if you're an electronics company and your company says, I own all your inventions, everything you do, but you come up with, working in your own garage, and you decide to invent a new broom, and what you do for your company is microcircuits, your company really does not have a right to the patent that you file on the new broom. And if they try to do that, unfortunately, you may wind up in litigation, but the reality is they shouldn't really have a right to that. They do have a right to, and here I'm on the side of the company, if the company's paying your benefits, giving you an office, making all this expensive electron microscope equipment available to you so you can come up with something new, they really should own the rights to the inventions that you do in the course of your employment. And interestingly, the higher up that somebody is in the company, the more that duty obtains, meaning that if I were the president of the company and I invented a broom, I might very well owe that broom patent to my company, because as the president, my duty of loyalty to the company is much, much higher than the employees who are below me. But in general, a company doesn't have the right to everything you invent. But if you're inventing something in the electronics area, even if it's not directly on what your job is, you may very well might owe that because the ideas for it, you came up with it on company time using a company computer, and you just may be stuck with that, and it may be totally justified.
David has asked if you can speak to provisional applications.
Sure. A provisional patent application is a quick and dirty patent application that allows you to say patent pending. Where they become way more important right now, I should also say provisional patent applications do not get examined. You must ultimately, within 12 months, file what's called a utility patent application, and that's the thing that gets examined. Now, what makes them way more critical now is because we're a first-to-file country and we didn't used to be. So provisional patent applications now are really sort of the first time that you have a thought about something, that here's what my invention could be, I'm thinking about this, here's the general elements, but I haven't totally completed my thought process. File a provisional patent application. The filing fee is cheap, it's like $100 or less, and then you're allowed to say patent pending, and you'll have at least provisional protection, meaning that you can talk about the idea to others without losing rights to that particular idea. So provisional patent applications, if you wrote a technical paper, before you file a technical paper, you can file a technical paper as a provisional patent application. So they're even more important, in my opinion, now that we're a first-to-invent country, because you don't have to wait until you've gotten all of the details together to file a provisional. File it on whatever you know at the time that you think is a good idea, and for the amount of money it costs to do that, it's worth it.
Okay, this next question is for Jessie from Diana. She's having trouble identifying the class to file a trademark application. Is there a way to getting a new class accepted?
The process for getting a new class accepted is very, very long, cumbersome, and it happens in Geneva. It happens at the level of the Nice Agreement itself, not at the level of the USPTO. However, you can call the USPTO, you can call the person who essentially has my position, the Administrator for Trademark Identification, Classification, and Practice, and ask for some help. I used to get calls like that all the time, and I was very willing to help. I know the person who took my place, and I'm sure she would be very willing to help. They can't give you legal advice, they can't give you absolute answers, but they can point you in the right direction. Also, if you go to the USPTO site, there's a manual there called the Trademark Manual of Examining Procedure, and in there, in Chapter 1400, is a list of all the Nice classes, all the classes under the Nice Agreement. And you kind of need to find the one that would work best for your product. It may take describing your product in such a way that the beginning of the description secures it in a particular class, and if there are other elements to it that may drift into another class. That becomes sort of secondary to the main thrust of how you're describing it, so that you can at least secure a class and get it filed in the office. But I would really try to give them a call. They're very open to it, and they do want to help. So I would give that a try, but also use the resources they have online. I'm assuming you know the manual is online, and you certainly, I see that you filed things to the TMID Suggest mailbox. The next thing to do is to give them a call and say, this is what I have, I'm having trouble, can you point me in the right direction? Again, I have to emphasize, they can't give you legal advice.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions about offensive inventing or inventions that are similar to something on the market. Do you have any examples of success?
Of success? Yes. There's a company, for example, I did invent something that was a keyboard sanitizer. You know, that thing that Jessie mentioned was an example of one of the inventions that I had. And somebody did come up with an improvement to that. And what they did was, this was an ultraviolet sanitizer. They came up with an ultraviolet sanitizing device that actually was a little bit more automatic in how it functioned. And the patent office determined that by virtue of the fact that it did this automatic function, even though the rest of what it did was the same as mine and others, I mean, there's lots of ultraviolet sanitizing devices out there, that improvement was something that was worthy of a patent. And so, you know, there's that sort of thing. You can always take somebody else's product and improve it. An example that I like to give is just more a fantasy type of example is, suppose that all existed and I have in my hand a cup which has no handles on it of any kind, and it's simply a plastic cup that has water in it. Well, if a handle for a cup never existed before, but you put a handle on the cup, then, and all of a sudden that makes the cup a lot more valuable for things like hot liquids and so on. Well, that's an improvement that makes a cup with a handle way more valuable than simply a cup without a handle, and that's worthy of a patent. So those are the sorts of improvements. It could be little things that actually wind up having a big impact on the marketplace.
Okay, next question is, what are your feelings relevant to process patents versus maintaining proprietary processes or product patents?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Take the Coca-Cola example. To this day, I think there's only 3 or 4 people who know the Coca-Cola formula, and therefore that formula is worth a fortune. Could they have obtained a patent? Well, maybe they could have, but then everybody would know what the formula for Coca-Cola is. So as a consequence, that would become less valuable. So a lot of times you may want to identify a particular process that you're using which really makes your product a whole lot better, but in your estimation is not a huge change to the technology. For something like that, I would resist filing a patent application because you might not get patent protection and your patent's going to get published. And that means everybody can use this change. But if what you see is that because that small change that you're going to make, and again, you have to look to the future, is the small change you are going to make you believe is going to be allow you to dominate in the marketplace, then that small change is something that you would want to file a patent application on. So it's really a judgment call. But keep in mind that if you've been using a process for a long time and you've used it secretly, you really can't get a patent on it. So you can't get a patent on it now. It would be looking to the future about some new process that you might be using.
We have time for maybe one more question. Todd has asked for clarification about your cup example. So he says you may patent the handle, but don't you owe royalties to the inventor of the cup?
The answer is possibly. And the reason I say possibly is, suppose, again, take my fantasy example here, that this cup that I've had has been around for ages, which of course, if you look back into Greek mythology, or not even mythology, Greek, Roman, pick your things that have been holding liquids have been around for centuries, thousands of years. But if nobody ever thought about putting that handle on it, or putting the handle on it made of a particular material, and that particular material did not conduct heat, then what you're getting the patent on is not on the cup, but the cup with the handle. Now, to your point is, if I'm in this era where the cup just got invented, then the answer is yes, you would owe royalties to the person that still has the existing patent. But if you looked around at all the products that exist now, I guarantee you could improve almost anything that you see and you would not necessarily owe royalties to somebody simply because you've improved a product that's been in the marketplace, hasn't been protected by a patent, or where there hasn't been a patent that is now expired. So don't do your investigation, but don't let that deter you.
Okay, well, that's all the time that we have for Q&A. Any additional questions can be emailed to ritalum@rit.edu or tweeted to @RIT_alumni with the hashtag #meritwebinars, #RIT webinars, and we will direct your questions to Jon and Jessie.